So the 2024 World Championship match was a very interesting tournament. A lot went on, some records were broken. Shout out to Volodymyr Mirzin from Russia, country 404, not to be spoken of in today's day and age apparently. Congrats to him, he's 18. We got some young world champions now. I think Magnus is going to play in the Blitz portion, and in this game that we are reviewing, we have Hans Niemann taking down the fruitiest grandmaster in history, that is Hikaru Nakamura. I don't want to hear it. If someone acts good 50% of the time and acts like a whiny crybaby toddler for the other 50% of the time, I ain't buying it. So, that is my opinion on Hikaru. Let's get into the game. This must have felt pretty good for Hans Niemann because he did get crushed in the Blitz match he had against him. So this is like redemption. This is his chess speaking for itself, as he would say. We get in Italian. We get bishop to c5, pawn to d3, development, a6. Okay, this plays for b5 in the middle game. And Hikaru plays this aggressive knight to d5 line. Now, what to do against knight to d5? You could take, but then that is going to be a good bishop and you don't have your knight on the king side. It's ill-advised to play something like pawn d6 because they will pin you. Nobody likes pins, even at the greatest level like these guys. So he goes pawn to h6, stopping anything from coming to g5, bishop to e3. And amazingly enough, if you take this bishop, you actually do not recapture with the knight. You recapture with the pawn. And though they say doubled pawns are bad, principles are made to be broken. You get the open F file as white. You're going to fight for the center D4 later, which will end up undoubling your pawns when you deal with E4, and life will then again be good. So rather than taking this bishop, Hans plays D6, and he's like, I'll get my own doubled pawns. This is a little bit of a wackier structure, but you over-control D4, so it stops or hinders white's ability to play D4. Not to mention when you play B5, you're going to have this mass expansion on the queen side and a pawn majority there then on. We get knight e3, repurposing the knight. g4, f5 are better squares for it to cover. We get castles, and rook to e8, guarding this pawn, untying this knight from the pawn. Pawn to a4, this does stop b5, or delays rather. We get pawn to b6. My apologies for those arrows. Another failed recording, as you guys always know. It solidifies c5. I don't think you want to fianchetto this bishop on b7 because this pawn chain is good against it. This bishop does deserve to be on this diagonal, but right now it just solidifies everything. Also, Hikaru lost to Brandon Jacobson against the move 1a4. What's funny is it's crazy. I used to play with Brandon, and Aaron is his brother. Used to go to Westfield Quads. I think that was in Jersey or Connecticut. And we used to be in the same quads all the time. So life is crazy. Respect to them. We get rook to b8, again, trying to play for b5. We get pawn c3, guarding this, opening up the queen. Not really guarding it, but opening up the queen on the queen side. Trying to play for d4 later on, which black has over-controlled now. We get queen to d6, bringing the queen out into the center of the board. Queen e2, finishing development and connecting the rooks. You can envision a rook on the d file that will ask questions to this queen once this pawn gets pushed to d4, is what I would be thinking. Pawn to g6, I quite like this move. The point is it stops these knights from coming to the 5th rank. And yes, your king is a little weak maybe, but white doesn't have a dark squared bishop to pose any problems on this softened fianchetto structure. So we get rook to d1, pawn to b5, pushing it, which is actually a mistake due to the exchange, and then actually bishop takes pawn. So I think Hans missed this, or he was like, I want to win this game. I want to create a balance. It was one or the other. The point is, now you have double isolated pawns. Double isolated pawns are gross. I mean, this pawn structure, this triangular pawn structure, never ends too well. Even worse if you didn't have an f-pawn. Well, look at black's pawn structure if he didn't have an f-pawn. Quite egregious. Pawn snaps off the bishop, and now d4, a discovered attack on the rook. Not to mention white is threatening taking, which would be a fork with a discovered attack on the queen. The whole board is about to be blown open. We get an exchange in the center. White does take the rook. Black takes the pawn, centralizing his own rook, and then knight to c4, a good move, jumping into the pocket that was created to gain a tempo on the queen. The queen moves up, has to still guard c5, And now Hikaru's like, I'm up material. I'm just going to trade pieces into a winning endgame. Good choice. Trade when you're up material. Right? Point value matters more. The more simplified the board, the less points there are on the board, the more a material advantage is felt. Principally speaking, there are exceptions. But this pawn could be a nuisance. Hans moves his rook to the second. They say the second and seventh rank are great for rooks. And then he jams his pawn onto the third rank, and now it's on the second rank. I mean, how did this pawn get to the second rank? You know those pawns where you can capture them, but you're like, that pawn's not going anywhere, and then it ends up being the bane of your existence, a future queen, mind you? That kind of looks like this pawn right now. We get rook to c1, attacking the knight, knight to b4, defending this knight, which is defending this pawn, which is coordinating and opening up the bishop to go to a6 and guard the pawn. That is one away from promoting. Hikaru blockades the pawn. I forget which famous grandmaster said always blockade past pawns, but it's a good tip. Knight to b3, trying to find some coordination. The king is the best piece in the endgame, and that's what makes this tricky. White is winning, but he can't really use his king. And if black can use his king, not to mention there are a lot of knights on the board, and in pure knight versus pawn endgames, you should play it as a pawn endgame. Another famous grandmaster said that. And if the king is the best piece in the endgame and one side can use it and the other side cannot, very easy to lose. Okay, Hans does not want to lose his bishop. That is a monster. Pawn to f3, not a great move. Why? It lets go of the e3 square. So Hans jumps his knight into e3. And now it's roughly balanced. And it's balanced with a pawn on e2, mind you. So not so balanced. If the king comes to f2, we would get knight to d1 check. And the king just has no coordination against this pawn. You would just keep improving the king. You might be like, isn't that a free pawn on b2? Not so fast. The rook would come to b1, and tactically, it just does not work for you. You get a bunch of trades. Knight takes d3. And here, white needs to go rook takes bishop. You might say, why not knight takes knight? Well, then simply you have two passed pawns, and the rook is not going to be able to stop them both. So in this position, you would take the bishop, they would take the knight, and then you win the pawn, and that is a rook versus knight. You will win that. So rather than king f2, we get pawn to b3. We still get knight to d1 because it still cuts off the king's entry. And again, black can move his king, white cannot. That's a big deal. Rooks like open files, kings like the center. So that's kind of what we get. The rook attacks the pawn, but the king is just in time. It's always crazy. Like these games hang, or chess largely in the endgame, hangs on the deal of a singular tempo. King c6, not moving too fast, not letting go of the c7 pawn, because later on that could be a future passer. Hikaru's like, let's trade. I'm up material. Hans is like, okay, trade on my terms, because then I can move. I will make a queen. So Hikaru can't do that. He moves his rook. Hans moves his knight. And he's getting his king in. The second this king reaches the second, it's going to be GG's. Rook c1 cuts off the king, attacks the pawn. Hans defends the pawn. And keep in mind the time. Hans is under a minute. Hikaru is just slightly over a minute. Knight to c2. A very good move, actually. Because if we get knight takes check, knight takes, this pawn is going to become a queen, regardless of if white takes the knight or not. So we get rook takes. Hikaru wins 2 knights for a rook. You might be like, isn't that a great trade? Typically, yes, but not with this king. See, these knights are not well versed to deal with this king. This king is a powerhouse, and this pawn might become a queen. So it does become a queen. We get a trade. It's a knight in 4 versus a bishop in 4, but it's an open board, and you have an outside pawn that will become a pass pawn since black's king is better coordinated against the queenside pawn. So he goes for the b pawn. He takes the b pawn. You might be like, okay, isn't this still roughly equal? Apparently yes, but apparently no. You have a 2-on-3 on the king side, but you have a 1-on-0 on the queen side, and your king is more active, so it's very hard to play this as white. His only chance was knight to f4, but it's not clear how you stop the pawn against this bishop. So instead he goes for g4, and there is only one winning move in this position. Can you find it? It is not pawn takes pawn, because if you take the pawn and push, this knight will get back on time. You might be like, how is it going to get back on time? Knights are sneaky. He's going to trade this knight for the pawn. This 2-on-1 with white now having the better king will lead to a draw. That would be king versus king. So the only winning move is c4. Now it's a race that black wins because he is up a tempo. Push. The knight is not in time to stop anything. Hans moves his bishop to stop the pawn from being pushed. Hikaru gets his knight back just in time, but not quite. Hans snaps the knight. Hikaru pushes. Hans makes a queen. Hikaru makes a queen. But Hans made a queen first, and he has a bishop. Not to mention, this h-pawn is huge that it's an h-pawn and not an a-pawn, because the promotion square is a light square. So no queen trade will work for Hikaru, because the bishop, that is a light square, will be able to kick white's king out of the pocket, and it'll still be a winning endgame. Han consolidates, and this is funny because his king marches all the way back to the 8th rank, where it is better, and it's just trying to find safety, find cover to avoid any checks. There are no more checks. Hans gives a check. Now he takes the h-pawn, creating a passer and setting up this battery, and it's just a matter of time. You can give a couple spite checks, but at the end of the day, there is nothing much. Hans must have really appreciated this win, because again, him and Hikaru do indeed have beef. Hikaru is giving some more checks, some spite checks. Again, queen trades will not work. And in this position, he resigns because the king will move to where there are no more checks, for example. And then you could just win this pawn. So, for example, queen f2, takes. It is the right-colored flank pawn, not the wrong-colored flank pawn, right? If it was on this side, the promotion square is a dark square. Light-squared bishop cannot kick the king out of the pocket. So, an amazing game. Did you guys think the winner of the rapid section would be? I wonder what the betting odds on that would be. But now we have the blitz portion incoming. I am excited for that. I will pay more attention to that. And thank you as always for watching. I'll see you guys tomorrow. Peace. Boom.